It's Berlin briefing time, and we asked the question whether Europe is actually caring about what's happening in Georgia right now. More than 300 arrests, the European Union says. Thousands of people on the streets. We're recording this on Thursday as the protests enter day 15 in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. And I'm very pleased to have on the line from right there Ambassador Giorgi Badridze. He's a senior fellow at the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. And here in the studio with me, I have Michael Thumann. He's a foreign correspondent in Moscow and Berlin for Die Zeit, a weekly news magazine. Before, he's also been in Turkey for that magazine. Now, he most recently also wrote a big book on Vladimir Putin's revenge, as you put it. So you'll put some perspective in connection with Russia there for us. But first, I want to ask Ambassador Badridze, what is happening right now in the Georgian capital?
Thank you for having me. At the moment, people are preparing to go back to the Rustaveli Avenue, a usual place where myself and tens of thousands of Georgians congregate every evening, and trying to reach out to the wannabe dictator Ivanishvili and tell him that it is time for him to go, that we would not stand idly as he is consolidating a state capture. This is exactly what he considers as the oligarch's dream, although his party is called the Georgian Dream, but what he has done is an oligarch's dream. And also it is a Russian dream. Like you mentioned, yes, Putin views Ivanishvili and his regime as his revenge on the freedom-loving Georgians who tried to break away from his sphere of influence and who basically are getting in the way of his project of making Russia great again. A project that is supposed to substitute his inability to deliver quality of life standards to his citizens. And he is now basically replacing a decent living for Russians by installing this idea of greater Russia.
Mr. Ivanishvili, of course, he is the oligarch who's founded the Georgian Dream Party, which won the October elections. There are question marks over how free that the environment in these elections were. We saw an election report that said that there was a lot of intimidation, but the OSCE, the organization who sent observers there, stopped short, of course, of declaring these elections not free and fair. Nobody's calling for a repeat of these elections. At the same time, there are concerns over this, and there are particularly concerns over these arrests and violence against demonstrators. And Michael, I want to bring you in here because we saw Emmanuel Macron call Mr. Ivanishvili on Wednesday, voice concerns over the violence and actually asking for the country to enter a dialogue, taking into account also the opposition concerns. This is actually one European state acting alone. Apart from that, we've seen statements of concern also from Kaja Kallas, the new High Representative for Foreign Policy in the European Union, but other European countries. Apart from that phone call, we've only seen Viktor Orban travel there and basically congratulate Mr. Ivanishvili. He's a friend of his. So what do we make of how Europe is positioning itself towards Georgia right now?
Well, I think Europe is severely distracted and not paying enough attention to what's happening there, because Georgia is a pivotal country in the region, and it's a pivotal country for Europe as well. And not only if we look at the Caucasus region, but also beyond to Central Asia. What I think was overdue that President Macron called, but I think other European leaders should call as well, and the European Union should get involved more strongly. I understand, of course, that the European Union was in a state of transition over the past weeks and months, But now the new commission should definitely get engaged and not let Russia basically organize the field and the political opposition and support the government against the opposition, what they are doing very actively.
Now, we bumped into each other at a foreign ministry briefing,
We did, yeah.
which was on a very different topic. But there the argument was that, look, the European foreign ministers are meeting next Monday. There is talk that there could potentially be talk of sanctions. What's also potentially on the table is that a visa easing of visa applications could be revoked. But we don't know. I mean, this will be more than almost a third week into the protests. What we have heard, though, is we've heard from the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Let's just take a listen to what he said.
What I'm seeing at this moment is that all allies are making clear that any actions that undermine the democracy in Georgia, or to take democracy further also on its road to more EU and NATO integration, Euro-Atlantic integration, so to say, that they really urge the Georgian government to stay on the path they decided a couple of years ago to be active on and not to retreat.
Now, this is interesting because together with Ukraine, Georgia was now infamously denied the path towards NATO membership. It's nowhere near that. And of course, with parts of Georgia occupied by Russian forces, this is not going to be on the cards anytime soon. But Ambassador, I would like to bring you in. How much did the opposition, how much did protesters on the street feel protected and actually backed up by this statement?
With your permission, could I go back to your previous statement,
Sure.
with which I respectfully disagree? First of all, the OSCE has not published its final statement.
No, but an
Final
initial
statement.
report is out.
And
Yes.
and the most important charge, and the reason why hundreds of thousands of Georgians protest this election, and why all of Georgia's allies are extremely concerned, is exactly that this vote was stolen. We're not talking about minor irregularities and intimidation. We're talking about vote stealing, including by direct ballot stuffing, which is video that we have this on record, including by multiple voting by individuals hired by the Georgian Dream and supplied with tenths of IDs and bussed around various voting precincts, etc. This was systemic rigging, vote stealing, which fundamentally changed the outcome. Georgia in the past never had ideally smooth elections, but this is probably the first one in which the government basically stole the outcome of the vote. That is the problem. And number two, we have actually most of our Georgia's partners have said that the Georgian authorities, or actually I wouldn't call them the government and authorities, now a de facto government, which has no legitimate basis of running the country. The whole idea is that we are demanding the rerun of the election under the international supervision. And these demands are coming also from our allies. And yes, Viktor Orban, who is friends with all sorts of authoritarian regimes and dictators, is the only one who embraced Ivanishvili and his claim based on his own values, I guess. But it's nowhere near any sort of international legitimization. So this is where we are now. The Georgian people, Georgia's allies, all demand the rerun of the election, even those who haven't officially recognized this election as illegal. None have recognized the vote as democratic and binding. So we are now in this impasse where we need the Ivanishvili regime to back down. And the main idea of President Macron's phone call was to somehow encourage Ivanishvili to rethink his rigid position. And as to your question, actually, I would also correct one record. You mentioned that 300 people were detained. Hundreds more were detained. Over 300 people were brutally beaten up by the police as after they were detained, because this has become a tactics of the government of trying to intimidate people. There were mass beatings first by the riot police. Then they changed tactics because they saw that people are not afraid. They were still coming back to Rustaveli Avenue. Then they employed the so-called titushki, the thugs, the mercenaries, which we first saw in Ukraine in 2014, which were hunting people in the alleys and kind of brutally beating them up. That didn't work either. At this stage, they are trying to approach this with intimidation with individual legal actions against activists or even sometimes random people, whoever have shown at the rally, whoever have any sort of influence. For instance, well-known people. They're trying to create this atmosphere of fear by bringing legal criminal charges or administrative charges against individual people. But we're not afraid. We'll be back on Rustaveli this night as well.
Ambassador, I'm grateful for your intervention there. The point I'm trying to make is that although it was an unusually strong statement from the observers, and I myself have been in the past an election observer. In 2004, I was an election observer in Georgia. It was very strong, but neither the OSCE, of which Russia is a member, nor the European Union, which has verified 300 people are being arrested, I'm going by those official figures, has officially called for a repeat of the elections. And we have the next elections coming up this Saturday. So this leaves us in a situation where we have an individual leader, Emmanuel Macron, call on these arrests to stop, the harassment of people who are on the streets to stop, and no violence. But he too has not called for a repeat of the elections. So, Michael, where does this leave the responsibility of European countries, and what kind of signal does this at this moment in time send to Moscow, which of course still continues to see Georgia as its front yard?
Well, the problem is that we see Moscow banking entirely of the present government, which has been elected in a severely manipulated election. I think this is what we can clearly state, and given also the fact that the exit polls indicated some 40% for the Georgian Dream, and then
it was 53 in the end.
In the end, it was 13% more, something we have never ever seen in any democratic election during election night. But anyway, so we see that Moscow clearly takes a strong stance supporting this government by all means, whereas the European Union tries to somehow stay in contact with the government, and on the other hand calls for dialogue, but of course stops short of any direct interference. So we are basically playing by the rules, whereas Moscow is not. And this is exactly the same playbook we have seen in 2014 in Ukraine, where Moscow was not playing by the playbook and violating rules and interfering in all kinds of ways, whereas European politicians, yes, clearly they appeared on the Maidan, and as also some European politicians appeared on Rustaveli Boulevard these days. But it's an uneven playing field. That's what I want to say, and I think we have to reconsider the measures and the approach we are having, given the very aggressive stance of Russia.
So, unsurprisingly, I'm glad you mentioned Ukraine. We're hearing very different action and a very different tone coming from Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, on Georgia. Let's take a listen to that.
I have just signed a decree that gives effect to the National Security and Defense Council's decision on sanctions. These sanctions target the part of the Georgian government that is surrendering Georgia to Putin. This is the very issue that is fueling the protests in Georgia right now. It is crucial that our partners also voice their position now, openly declaring what is happening, and action must be taken.
So, Ukraine and the Baltic states are imposing sanctions. The European Union is not speaking with a united voice. I want to throw that back to you, Ambassador. What impact is that having on how this is playing out in Georgia, particularly ahead of key elections on Saturday, where the current president is saying she will not let herself be voted out of office until there is a repeat of these elections?
First of all, Georgians believe that it is up to us to win back our freedom. We are not counting, by the way, on any meaningful action by the OSCE, which, well, includes Russia, and it's not realistic to expect even a document that would be very plainly stating the facts. Number two, even the European Union, the Hungarian foreign minister 2 days ago said plainly that his country would block any sanctions, including on those thugs perpetrating these crimes against peaceful demonstrators. So both institutions are basically hostages of the elements within, which have very strong conflict of interest, including regarding Georgia and regarding democracy in general. And yes, individual countries now have been voicing their strong support with the Georgian people and specific measures against the representatives of the regime. As for the so-called election of the president, as you probably are aware, there will be no election. It will be the appointment of the new president by the Electoral Council, which is directly and 100% controlled by Ivanishvili. And this means that as long as this deadlock is in place, as long as Georgia lacks a legitimate parliament and a government, there will be no real new president. And this is why President Salome Zurabishvili has vowed to stay in her position as long before she gets a proper legitimate replacement. So, and I think she can count on full support of the Georgian people. I think the epicenter of the protest actions will move towards the presidential palace when this happens, when the government will announce the appointment of the new phony president. And by the way, it is quite symbolic that Mr. Ivanishvili has selected the least qualified person you can imagine to hold that, even though symbolic but very important institution. A former footballer, but also not even a better one among the footballers, a very mediocre footballer in the past, and a person who failed to run for the presidency of the Football Association of Georgia because he lacks education at all. Not just a higher degree, but any education. He's basically illiterate. And this is an insult to the Georgian people, a final insult, a very symbolic gesture on part of Ivanishvili. This is what he thinks of Georgia's democratic institutions. This is a classical state capture. Many people compare the candidate for the president to a very famous horse from the history, from the Roman history. And actually, well, because Ivanishvili's love for animals and his private zoo and his kind of affinity toward zebras, he usually is referred as Ivanishvili zebra. But situation is not funny at all.
I just want to put this into context. Mr. Ivanishvili, he's essentially an oligarch who made his fortune in Russia. He's now lives in Georgia. He's famous or infamous for apparently owning a zebra and collecting old trees, which are transported from all of the country to his estate, which is above the capital, Tbilisi. There's a cable car, which I'm told is not functioning at the moment, which leads up to his estate, and he overlooks the capital. So it's a bit of a James Bond-like kind of scenario. Now we have the current president, Salome Zurabishvili, warning that there actually is terror, and she says terror on the citizens of Georgia, on the youth and various segments of society. We're speaking here on Thursday, Michael. We're heading up to Saturday, where there will be these presidential elections, which by all looks and means will lead to a constitutional crisis in the country if we have this conflict of who is actually legitimately elected. And I just want to, we put this question to the spokesperson of the German foreign minister at a press conference here on Wednesday, and this is the response we got.
I believe we have made our position on the events in Georgia very clear. Just a few days ago, there was a statement from the foreign ministers of the Weimar Triangle, and it has surely not gone unnoticed that the question of how to deal with Georgia is on the agenda for the European Union's Council of Ministers next Monday.
So on Monday, and that statement also issued, it expressed concerns. We also heard that from the spokesperson of Kaja Kallas, the representative for Foreign Affairs of the European Union, newly appointed, but doesn't go beyond that. So does Europe have this time, or what is going on?
Well, I'd say seen from this respect that we will have, as of Saturday, probably two presidents of Georgia, Zurabishvili and the football star. The European Union has then time to reflect on Sunday and decide on Monday on whom to recognize or whom to support. And because I'm sure the answer from Moscow will be, of course, we support the newly elected president, and Mrs. Zurabishvili will be voted out of office. So, but as we have a constitutional crisis, and there are many doubts about the legitimacy of the new parliament, all this has to be voiced by the foreign ministers, and I think also a kind of tendency has to be visible on whom they support, because I think Europe can't just stay aloof and stay neutral on this question, as other interested parties are so active.
But Hungary will have a veto.
Definitely so, but it's always possible that we've had that many times, and we know that because Hungary and because Viktor Orban is basically acting on Vladimir Putin's behalf on every foreign policy issue, as Putin's ambassador to the EU. It's a general procedure that then other European countries would come together and basically come out with a statement. We do that also on many different issues in the world. So why not in this case?
Ambassador Badridze, what would be your expectation? What would help Georgians, those who are risking their own security by going onto the streets?
Well, I think the most important part is for the European nations and their union to stay true to their principles. Georgia is fighting for its democratic future. Georgia is a frontline country of democracy. This also needs to be taken into account. It's not an isolated, faraway country of which Europe knows little. It will directly affect the European interests. So it's a mixture, a combination of values-based policy and also strict geopolitics. And both should be taken into account. And it looks like Russia traditionally understood the value of Georgia to the European Union better than many European countries themselves. For instance, Georgia's international function as a bridge between the wider Black Sea region and the wider Caspian Sea region, the Central Asian region, so rich with resources, so rich with huge untapped economic potential. And Georgia is basically the link, the only link between these two vast regions that could give access to Central Asian nations toward the European markets outside Russian control or outside Iranian control. And the same goes for the European Union. We are the way of reaching out to these nations. This would help further diversify energy imports and help energy security of the European Union. This too, and I cannot help but correct again once the record. This is not a football star. Georgia has many football stars. He's not one of them. He's a former mediocre footballer who played in Russia. Okay, well, he played in minor European clubs as well. But
if he was a better football player, I think that wouldn't qualify him necessarily for the presidential post anyway.
At least there would be some point.
Let's just agree that being able to play football...
like I said, Georgia is a great footballing nation. We have many football stars, including those who played in Germany, who play now in Italy and helped win the Italian championship, who play in England, who play in Spain. And we have many football stars. And we have many retired football stars. He's not one of them.
From a German point of view, let me say that Franz Beckenbauer, it was good that he was Kaiser, but that he never became Chancellor.
Let's just agree that being able to play football is an add-on for a politician and not a key qualification. So I would just like to wrap up by asking you, Michael, and also you, Ambassador, what is at stake in Georgia right now, both for the Europeans but also for Russia?
Well, from the European point of view, there is at stake, first of all, Georgia as an open country, which it has been since the 1990s when it became independent of the Soviet Union and independent of Russia, which exercises its influence since the beginning of the 19th century in Georgia. The second is, of course, keep Georgia, as the ambassador just mentioned, as a bridge further to the Caspian Sea and Central Asia, as so many pipelines and so many transport routes. Georgia is a hub, and it's a hub which is very significant for the European Union. Russia knows this, and this is what makes it so interesting for Russia, not only because of these traditional power projection of Russia in the region, but also because they know they can disrupt all these communication lines through Georgia. And of course, they can disrupt Europe's idea that democracy and an open society would spread in the region and also in the Caucasus, where we have, besides Georgia, Azerbaijan with an authoritarian regime, and Armenia with a democracy under threat.
Ambassador Badridze, what's your biggest hope and your biggest concern as you're heading into these elections on Saturday, but also into potentially a constitutional crisis in Georgia?
Well, I really hope that Georgians who are determined to fight regardless, but that Georgians won't feel left alone facing the Russian imperialist, colonialist policies. And I sometimes do not understand how our Western partners do not see Russia's actions exactly for what they are. This is classical imperialist, colonialist policies conducted by not so efficient, not very good government, which has proved to be extremely good at corruption, but who hasn't delivered much better standards of life to its own citizens. We need to understand Russia potentially is the world's richest country. It controls the largest share of natural resources in the world. And yet Russia is nowhere near the team of the wealthy countries. And it all owes to the system of governance, to the political system, to the power vertical which Putin built, which is founded upon corruption. And this is the system that Putin feels would be under threat if democracies flourish in the neighborhood. He is afraid of democracy more than he's afraid of NATO. This is why this fight is essential and important, not just to us.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Badridze, for taking the time during these very uncertain times and key times for Georgia, but also for the EU and Russian influence in that region. Michael Thumann, thank you very much for your analysis here in the studio. That was Berlin Briefing for this week. We'll be back in 7 days' time, and you'll find us on YouTube at DW News, on dw.com Berlin Briefing, and all major podcast platforms once a week from now onwards. And if you don't want to wait another week for news on the current German political drama and the German view on the events worldwide, we've also got our DW Berlin Briefing newsletter. So do sign up for that. And thank you very much.